Hey, this is Pete A. Turner, executive producer of The Break It Down Show. I'm filling in for John today on the intro since this episode features some of my work as an academic warrior. As many of you know, my time working as a spy in the Army provided me with quite a few opportunities to learn about modern conflict and how that works, what I call the ground truth. Most of you who listen to the show get to hear these lessons and thoughts from episode to episode. Today's episode focuses on one of these ground truth-based elements. Dr. Ledet, a frequent contributor to the show, Sharon Emiegh, and I co-authored a peer-reviewed paper titled Recognizing the Ethical Pitfalls of Female Engagement in Conflict Zones for the Journal of Military Ethics. Dr. Rich and I sit down in the guest chair today while best-selling author Scott Huesing hosts the episode, which he recorded while he was in D.C. Scott had a hard out, so he actually had to stop recording with us before the very end. So Rich and I did a bit of recording on our own, so you hear some inserts in the show, a la the Well Pod. Hat tip to Anson Mountain, Branan, Edgens for their fantastic show, which you guys should all check out. Finally, I wanted to thank all of you for listening. I love being able to create the show, and you all are always on my mind when I decide what's next. We just finished our most successful month ever in April. Listeners from dozens of countries, nearly every state in the U.S. are listening, and I want to thank all of you. Reach out to me on Twitter, Pete A. Turner, Facebook, whatever. Thank you again, and enjoy today's episode.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay
This
Moore.
is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick
This
Marotta.
is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
This is Dr. Rich Ledet. You are listening to The Break It Down Show.
And now, The Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
Yeah, this is the episode. Scott is actually hosting Dr. Ledet and myself because we wrote a peer-reviewed paper and we wanted to create an audio record and conversation of it. So I'm going to step out of the way and let Scott do what Scott does well.
Yeah. Hey, Doctor, welcome to the show. I'm in D.C. right now, and where are you at?
Oh, man, I'm down here in the deep, deep, deep South, Alabama.
Deep south of Bama. And then PD's out in L.A. You know, this is I wouldn't call it a weird episode. I think it's I call it an academic episode where people want to tune into this show and listen to really, I think, hear how there's so many different layers of Pete Turner, for one, because he's not, just a gregarious podcast and soldier and spy, but the work you guys have done on this paper that you recently presented down there about titled Recognizing the Ethical Pitfalls of Female Engagement in Conflict Zones, I think shows, real academic side that, we leave the military, we leave service, we leave academia, but we're also students of the trade, and we're committed to being lifelong learners and taking our experience and presenting that in a way. So I'll turn this over to you, Pete, and I want you to tell us why it was important for you to talk about female engagement in conflict zones, why that topic is important.
Well, first off, Rich and I are both feminists. We look like big, burly white dudes, but it turns out we believe that ladies have the power to do incredible things, and in a society, we want to support that. And so I'll speak for Rich and say we expect the military to work at a higher standard, and sometimes it's just not possible. But, if someone doesn't show them how, you can teach, and Scott, you know this, and Rich was an infantry guy, you can teach an infantry dude to do anything. They really are probably the best type of service member there is. They are so pliable, so tough, and brilliant. So when I was out working in the conflict zone scene and watching unit after unit roll through and try to do all these different things, they just had no preparation, no idea of how to prepare, and came in with the cockiness that an infantry unit should have, or any kind of field unit like artillery or tankers, but they lacked the subtlety of the softer skills. So I always wanted to give these lessons back. And look, a commander, a company, a battalion, they want to reject this stuff anyhow because it's external from their experience. But that doesn't forgive me, and it doesn't forgive that commander the responsibility of trying to get to a better place so that everybody, if we're going to be there and we're going to put ourselves in harm's way, that we do a better job at it. That's the main reason why I do most of these kinds of shows, is to pass along the incredible lessons I've had the opportunity to learn. And I got to learn them mostly by just being there and watching us collectively just not be prepared for what's coming down the road.
Even though we could have been prepared, Pete.
Well, that's true.
Scott, you said a couple things that caught my attention. You said students of the trade, and then you said lifelong learners, and Pete just touched on that too, and just remarking on the infantry, you could teach an infantryman to do just about damn near anything, not just break stuff and blow stuff up and shoot stuff, and
although we're great at that. Definitely.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, that's generally why we get involved in the trade to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
But as it turns out,
adolescence at its best, we get paid good money to hang out with bros and shoot guns and break stuff, which is in our DNA. But
totally,
I think as you evolve, you learn there's more to it than that to be successful at your job as an infantryman.
And my body can't handle the job of an infantryman anymore, but my mind has gotten a lot sharper. And that's because all three of us, I do believe, are students of the trade. The stuff Pete was just talking about, we can train for this stuff. We just didn't, or we tried to train once we were already doing it. So we kind of took a backwards approach.
Let me give some perspective on that, so the listeners understand too. Is we do train to a lesser degree, but again, when our mission is to kill or capture, insurgent forces, that's our main mission. And I subscribe to the I guess, concept that if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. Right. And if you're trained to do these things, and we want to build it as part of our culture on how we handle and improve the conditions of women in these modern combat zones, we really have to have a specialized force that is specifically trained to deal with that, and then become part of the infantry unit. I think that is vastly characteristic of special operations forces when they engage with people at the small teams. But I almost think you have to have a small team of resident experts. Maybe they're guys like you that we bring in as embeds with PhDs in front of their name that really help us understand this, and we really task the appropriate person. And I've said this 1,000 times, but it's always got to be the right guy for the right job for the right reason. And in this case, it may be a guy and it may be a female that is engaging with females. That other 50%, as our good friend Selena Hayes always says, to really make an effective impact on the conditions in which we're fighting. I think that's important. What do you think about that, Phil?
Oh, you're actually speaking to some things we talked about in the paper. You don't have to have a penis or a vagina, right? But what you got to have is an academic level understanding of the concepts and a working knowledge of how they're going to be deployed. In the paper, we talk about how we need an understanding of things like anthropology, economics, politics, psychology, sociology, all of the soft science disciplines. And if you've got a mind that can handle that stuff, you overlap that with some, I can shoot, move, and communicate. Yeah, you're right. You can be embedded, and you can bring some knowledge into that small team environment. And hopefully that small team can have some kind of some trickle out effects and have larger impacts on, company operations, battalion operations, and brigade operations.
Well, you also say in the abstract of the paper, which I have in front of me, is you say that, critics charge that these initiatives of, engaging with the female population or using FET teams or whichever model you use, they're not adequately linked to doctrine-based training. Before you answer the question, the question is, who are the critics that you want to address? And I would also submit that we have the best doctrine in the U.S. military that 1980 had to offer. So we were fighting a different war. We have been at war for 15 years now during this long war in Afghanistan, Iraq, and the Horn of Africa. So we don't have a bunch of dudes in think tanks sitting around with this academic hat on, recreating doctrine to really address these needs. So go back to the original question. Who are the critics that charge that such initiatives as you've written here were not adequately linked to doctrine-based training?
This is a great question, and one of my favorite things about the paper and why we titled it the way we did. We piss everybody off. So you have the people that want there to be more tanks and materiel and all that kind of thing. And God bless all these people. They're all passionate and trying to do the right thing. We're all trying to lift the same load. Just Rich and I are like, hey, there's a problem over here. This is what we're trying to identify. The other side are the females who can't even stomach the title or the topic from us. And they're instantly critical without even having taken 5 minutes to understand it. So in terms of speaking to the female side, we're saying it's so important to address the female thing appropriately that it's inappropriate. It's wrong to do it any other way. But here are some pitfalls you have to be aware of. You as a commander, Scott, who owns battle space, your job is to close with and destroy the enemy and win. To use the Huesing maxim, I command you I order you to win, and kill. So we have to let you do what you're ethically supposed to do. You can't go to some mom of a fallen Marine and say, sorry, we spent about 40% of our time working on less than lethal skills that are vitally important to the development of the country that we're in. Like at some point, you run out of, like, if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. You run out of ethical bandwidth, and you can't get that job done. So the critics are the people that don't understand that you as a commander who owns battle space, you're still going to engage the local populace. And that's always, no matter what era of war we think we're in now, that's always going to be the case. There's going to be displaced people that are there, people that you displace, and we have to understand how to deal with them. And then the minute that the combat fighting is over, the other stuff starts. And so these things, this is a murky soup.
Let me jump in, build on what Pete was just saying, because if you read the very next sentence, that starts with, we go further in that abstract, because we're those critics too. We're the ones trying to point out with this paper that there was a huge gap between the theory and the practice, and we were there to witness it. But we're also two people that aren't afraid to tell you there is a place for women in combat. And having been on patrols with women, having been in combat situations with women, and I've said it on the show before, I would go to combat again with some women that I know than most of the men that I know. So we are part of the critics that are looking at this, but we want to close the gap between theory and practice. And we make what I believe is a pretty strong argument that we can train to this stuff. And I know that there's some initiatives in the DOD that are, kind of geared this way, but we're part of that. We're part of that critical group as well.
I want to jump in too and add this part. Like Scott, as a trainer of Marines, and Rich as an infantry guy, and myself as a spy, but still, we all know how to improve putting rounds on target. If you have a Marine that's shooting low and left, you can look at your gunny and say, fix that. And you guys both know what he's going to do. And you're going to work on the basics. Those tools don't exist for these kinds of skills.
No, and I think that they were very ad hoc at the onset of this war, because we again, after 9/11 happened, it was kind of learn on the fly for a lot of the things we did, even though we had plenty of historical examples of how to operate in Afghanistan, how we were supposed to operate in Iraq, but I think they were very dated. So we created these plug-and-play solutions like the female engagement teams. The Marine Corps had the Lioness program, which, again, was kind of insulting in and of its definition, Lioness. We had to put a gender title on their role even instead of just, engagement team. Like, the engagement team could be a combination of both male and female to deal with all sorts of situations as they came through processing centers, entry control points, vehicle checkpoints, all of these things. So, and that is just one example of how we had to continually adapt. We had to adapt with materials, how we armored our vehicles, how we armored the Marines and soldiers, how we thwarted electronic countermeasures when we had remote controlled electronic explosive devices and IEDs. So we've had all of these things. So, I mean, for the listeners, that's a myriad of tasks that, again, as great as the infantry community is, and we pride ourselves on adapting, overcoming, and all of those bumper stickers that we throw around, this is something that we're really dealing with that is critical, because now we're talking about the human element. And that's something you can't really quantify because everything we do in the military, and especially in the infantry, it's a people business. So when we're talking about female engagement, it's not just understanding demographics or understanding the female culture, but really understanding how to leverage that to allow us to fight and win. And as a commander, so I'm sorry, Richard, I totally agree with what you're saying. Is we miss that whole piece of it. So I'm a fan, just as you are, and I wish I would have had more of that as a guy on the ground at the tactical level. But getting back to the critics of the piece, at the tactical level, we can all sit and pine about what we didn't have and what we wish we had more of. But do you put the onus on those at the political level or at the strategic level who really had the power to allocate and apportion funds and resources to push those resources down to the guys on the ground that really needed it to make it happen? Who would you put more of the blame on?
You want to get my political science brain working? Because
yeah, I want you to hold someone accountable.
You're speaking to me right now. You're speaking to my heart and my mind. I think it was Donald Rumsfeld that said, you go to war with the army you got, not with the army you want. Yep. And I don't want to, we'll have to check me on that one later, Pete, to see if he actually said it, because that's the exact wrong attitude. And I want to curse right now when I'm saying this, because no, actually you train up the army you have to do the job that you need them to do. Same thing with the Marines. Same thing with the Air Force and the Navy. You make sure that your personnel are ready to go. Now, mind you, sometimes you got to, shit hits the fan and you got to move. But you should already be ready for that. And I just can't, I just cannot believe policymakers didn't see this coming. The thing is, they didn't want to see it coming, because academics have been working on this stuff for a long time, and I'm not just talking about military science. I mean, there's a lot of work in development. There's a lot of work that looks at human rights. There's a lot of work that looks at democratization and state building. And we should have seen it coming. Kind of like the fall of the Soviet Union, Some people saw it coming, but those people were never listened to.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting. And that's a great, I love throwing, great quotes around too. And I'll use one too, is we're notorious for, doing more with less in the military. And a good friend of mine and fellow author, retired Marine Pete Munson, wrote a fabulous paper. Instead of saying do more with less, he says do what matters with less. And that is so spot on. I get chills every time I recite Pete's great quote, because Munson nailed it. It's like, hey, do what matters with less. So again, it's realigning what your priorities are in a combat zone and how to be most effective. And I think that, again, when we're talking about female engagement, we're talking about how it affects our military force and also the civilian population that we're fighting amongst in an insurgency. Many people have heard me say this, and I agree with you 100%, and Selena, who's a good friend of the show, Selena Hayes with Hayes International Group, is that we've effectively bypassed an entire 50% of a population by not doing these things. And you're totally right, Richard, when we say that we didn't want to see those problems, because that just essentially became this massive rock that we had to throw in our pack with all of the other gear. And ignorance is bliss. But this is an area where we cannot ignore it. And I think you guys have really hit on some great points in this paper about female engagement and how we need to really, I think the big takeaway for me is the importance of incorporating this into future doctrine and how it needs to be at least a consideration of what we do in every war zone, every conflict that we go into, because we can't continue to ignore the other 50% of the population. I think it's foolhardy, and I think it's a recipe for repeating mistakes and not being good students of our history and not being good students of what we do. So my question to either one of you, Pete, is how do we get better at that? How did you address that in this paper?
Well, the getting better part, first you have to identify the full problem, and I do want to say this, because I was good at what I did and I learned it on the ground through our experiences. When I would talk to your peers, I could say, I can help you see the things you can't see, and allow you as a commander to marshal the way you want to marshal. My job mainly was to pipe information to you so you could adjust effort. And oftentimes that meant doing less or nothing. So I'm like, hey, your FET is killing people. You would say, okay, all FET operations stop. And that would actually be the ethical thing to do in a lot of cases. And I'm being dramatic for the purposes of the show, but practical and real in terms of the advice we often gave was do less, and so do what matters and do even less than that until you really find what really matters. Because what we want to do, what we can do are completely different things. The other thing I wanted to get into, like the second ethical pitfall, and I'll kick this over to Rich, but we have to understand the role of the elder, of the uncle, of the informal governmental leaders. As much as we want to set up this formal government and reestablish things, that's not exactly how it works. And I'm going to give it over to Rich.
Yeah, and I would add, specifically to Afghanistan, and I'm guessing to some extent in Iraq, what's the role of that religious elder? What's the role of that informal authority piece that's actually holding together that village cluster in that valley as, an essential symbol of the rule of law? That's hard stuff for us to stomach. That's real hard for us to understand, especially since we're just going to go to the ground and fix stuff. We're just going to go fix it. But, and I like what Scott's saying about, this is 50% of your population here, right? But the other thing to consider is this is hard work and it takes time, right? So we're not just going to go and improve the situation for women overnight, especially because as Pete's mentioning here, you got to consider the role of the male elders here, whether you like it or not, because they're the ones who have been upholding the rule of law for centuries. And we're not just going to go and change that over the course of a decade in combat. A good example that I like to give, I use this in class, go look at the timeline of women's suffrage in the United States. And you tell me if we're just going to go to Afghanistan and fix it.
Well, yeah, I think that again, for the listeners who really need to understand what a day in the life is of especially at the tactical level for people, is I think before we get into that, you really hit on something I've written about and I talk about is that's American hubris at its best, is that we have 2 centuries of problem solving on how we treat women better within our own culture. And then we go into these areas like Afghanistan, which is similar to being on the moon, or the cradle of civilization in Iraq. And we're going to impose our Western philosophies and mindset on a culture that's been around for 5,000 years with our Italy 250-year existence. And that's frustrating. And because we can't accept what you were talking about, the role of the male tribal elder or the role of Islam in these regions. And we view those things, in my opinion, as these massive barriers to accomplishing what we want to do to be effective with the implementation of female engagement at whatever level. And I think that there's we can talk all day as guys who've been kicking doors in and getting shot at and blown up about how important it would have been to have more support at the tactical level with female interpreters or dog handlers. What about at the operational and strategic level? Where are the military and political planners that are engaging with females within those nations' governance and at the strategic level? Those counterparts do not exist. So I think listeners understand is when we have a small percentage of our military population who are females, there's no counterpart to that within the Afghan National Army or the Iraqi Armed Forces. That just doesn't exist. So it's an additional barrier that we haven't been able to get through. So moving forward, we could talk all day at the tactical level, but if we don't have it 3 steps up, how do we solve that problem?
Man, this is square on the shoulders of the policymakers, man. Absolutely. But then I also, it's actually also on the population that keeps voting in the same idiots that keep giving us the same bad policy. So here's an example for you, and it may not answer your question, but I think it illustrates what you're getting at. We're working in Afghanistan. There was a congressional delegation of women, and we were not permitted to go and meet with them, right? But you know what they did? They paraded out the few female leaders that they had, and I'm forgetting what level of government. Maybe they were part of the provincial council. Maybe Pete can help me.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah, and these women got to meet with representatives and from the United States, and they had their nice little photo op. And guess who couldn't even go to the meeting? The two dudes that have been on the ground working on stuff, you know, because, well, we would have told them, well, we'd have gave them the ground truth. We can't have that, right?
Rich, I wanted to jump in with you here mid-conversation with Scott, because you're telling the story of how, people from a higher level came into our area and wanted to talk about lady problems, but we weren't allowed to go, which wasn't the first time that we were barred from an area where we had specific expertise and experience. You know, I'm talking about the rehab stuff when they were having the rehab conference as well. So when we look culturally at these things, these systems that we have internally, where we all know each other, we all share a common culture, we don't permit ourselves access to the answers that might be present. How in the world are we supposed to expect the Afghans to do it if we can't allow ourselves access to ourselves?
Man, I can't count how many times the word hubris was used in this conversation. And we got to get rid of that. We can't just be solving the whole world's problems. We can solve some, and we can get better at solving the problems we're already trying to work on. But, taking a step back, first of all, I believe you talked about this earlier, and just getting out of the way of the host nation is one thing. But man, also take a step back and test your own assumptions. Take a step back and test your own knowledge. Look for your own knowledge gaps. Take a step back and realize, like, wait a minute, maybe the answer is not in dropping more bombs. Maybe the answer is in that textbook, on my shelf that's collecting dust that I didn't bother to read when I was going through my, undergraduate political science class or whatever, not just my discipline of political science, man, an understanding of history. How many mistakes did we make in Afghanistan that were mistakes that other people have been making since the 19th century, Oh, wait, that's our next paper. So back to the policymakers. Until there's a recognition at the top, and I mean at the top of the DOD, when are we going to get a female Secretary of Defense? That might be a start, but that's not what you need. But some kind of recognition at all of these the upper echelon, the spaceship needs to recognize that we can kind of change our methodology here.
Let's not be contradictory to the paper, and what we're talking about here is you could say you need a female Secretary of Defense for that perspective. What you need is people with both perspectives and willing to understand and implement those things. Because as you started off, I don't care what you have between your legs. I care what you have between your ears to be an effective leader,
right,
or to be an effective operator on the ground. And I think that is probably one of the most important things, is this graybeard mentality of these old generals or these old politicians who just are unwilling to accept and implement the difference between gender and sex roles, and the capabilities that bringing the right person for the right job for the right reason, I think is applicable at every single level to make this, as we framed the problem, and you guys have academically framed this in this paper, I think that's a real step forward to solving the problem. What are your thoughts, Pete?
Well, I want to continue to define the problem, because when we do look operationally and strategically and theoretically, one of the problems is all of the people that worked in the FET program or the CST program, which focused on like the SEALs and supporting them at a higher level. If you ask those ladies, they did a great job, and they won't be wrong in saying that. But what Rich and I would say is, going out to a village once and never returning to that village does not improve the condition of females in that valley. And matter of fact, that means that you're actually harming the condition of them, because you can't reliably prove that you've done anything well. that again goes on the policymakers and the people that establish billets. You know, if Scott, if you had a female engagement team attached to you, you have no idea how they've been certified or accredited to be in a battle space. You just trust that they're ladies and they're going to go talk to ladies and do lady shit. And that's all we have time for. That ain't good enough. Like that's just flat not good enough. And I want to get back to the elders a little bit and talk about this. So you're going to have this female engagement team running around the valley with you, and they're doing their damnedest. All right, everybody's got great intention, but they're just flat not prepared. So when Rich and I are talking to a group of elders, dads, and we're like, tell us about ladies and what you. It turns out we didn't invent Afghan women. They know that women are there, and they have a design for what they want for them. And if we can't start by accepting that, and that is in and of itself an extraordinarily complex thing. How does Sher Ali, he's our standard Afghan example, how does Sher Ali protect his daughter? How does he develop her into a woman? What is his personal mission? And then how about his neighbor who totally disagrees? One's more liberal, one's more conservative. This stuff is extraordinarily complex, and if we can't even allow these men to do what they do, then we're obsolete the moment we step our foot on the battlefield.
Especially since we're asking them to, change their culture essentially. And we have it, there's not even safety, and safety is a primary concern, and until the valley's safe and until the uncle himself can walk across the street without, fear of violence, he's not gonna let his young women, his girls, his wife, his nieces, so how do we fix that? And it's a multi-layered problem.
So let me go back to these elders, right? So as Rich talked about security, the example we use in the paper is one that I found in Iraq, where the guy I was talking to was describing freedom. And he's like, I just want to be left alone. I don't want to have to worry about my neighbor telling on me or whatever. And then 2 seconds later, he tells me a story of how he had to beat his daughter because she had spent too much time on the roof hanging up laundry. Because that's how he has to protect his family. It sounds horrible to beat your daughter because she's on the roof too long, but what happens if he doesn't administer justice and someone finds out about it, and all of a sudden now the entire family is targeted? This is the complexity of the problem set that we have to understand, that staying alive means beating your kids at times.
Well, those are, again, cultural differences that I think, again, Western society, the things that we find acceptable and, normal here in Western culture, we place these judgments on these cultures. And that's a very stark example that you just gave. But, even in America, corporal punishment in schools happened, kids still get the belt for talking off to their parents. So, But when it's portrayed as a problem in war and how we move forward to do this, I think we judge these cultures unfairly because again, there's a lot of hypocrisy in that. I think that we don't want to accept our own guilt, our own failures as Americans, and we have grand plans for what we want to do with these regions and how we win these wars. But ultimately, I think it's a projection of our own guilt for the things we do bad here in our own country. It's not a singular problem that's endemic to one culture. I think our culture is guilty of that as well. So to move forward and really figure out what a solution to the problem is too, we have to be a little bit pragmatic. And I think the religious boundaries we put on ourselves too have really slowed the progress of how we really define what I like to say, what is winning in this region, and not only defining winning, but how does that ultimately affect the enhancement of our national security? How do you think by implementing this theory and this paper of, as we conduct operations at any level, and it may be soft operations, it may be full scale conflict, how does this enhance what we're doing on a broader spectrum to achieve success in those regions where we fight by having this capability? And how does that affect our overall national security as a culture here in America?
Oh, that's
Wow.
pretty. That's what we call a loaded question, but it's loaded with goodness.
I don't think it's loaded. I think we really need to ask ourselves that question. You know,
Yeah,
we don't go to war to just kill bad guys. We go into these countries, we kick doors in, and we drop bombs because there's something in it for us.
Yeah.
So if we can gain the end state of what's in it for us, and it may be oil rights, it may be mineral rights, it may be creating regional stability to continue to maintain open sea lines of communication and diplomatic relations. And we could totally bypass that 50% if that achieves our means. But what you're saying in this paper to a degree is if we don't do this, if we don't engage the female population, we're not ever going to be successful in those areas. So that's I don't know if that's a loaded question or not, but I think it's an important component to what we're talking about in this paper, which I support wholeheartedly.
Yeah. No, I didn't mean loaded as in like you're trying to bias. You're trying to give me you're writing a question or asking a question that forces me to give a biased response. I meant in that it's loaded with goodness. It's loaded with context. So I guess like one thing that keeps coming to mind, because you talked about, you mentioned, you brought up the word hypocrisy. And there's a lot of hypocrisy in our foreign policy. And bringing this back to like, what can we do to make us safe? For example, Saudi Arabia just lifted the ban on women driving last year, I believe, right? Now that's a big step forward, I guess, in terms of civil rights and then the broader aspect of human rights. Now, does that make anybody safer? Well, maybe not if women haven't gone to the DMV and passed their driver training, right? But Saudi Arabia is one of our strongest allies. And we don't really care about women's rights there. But yet we're trying, and Afghanistan is, in terms of development, is pretty far behind Saudi Arabia, I believe. So we can't just go to Afghanistan and expect to flip a switch overnight and all of a sudden women are integrated into the legislature. Women are now part of the workforce. Women are now getting college educations. That's just not feasible. But what can we do? Well, we could start small. First of all, one initiative that Pete and I worked on was education initiatives. Teaching people how to read and write is a step, but that's a small little baby step. Now, how do these things translate into national security? Well, first of all, we can stop screwing up so much. That would be a start. And if we stop screwing up so much on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan and the Horn of Africa, well, then, maybe that can translate into long-term success in the sense that we're making less terrorists, because we still create a lot of terrorists. We also create a lot of just sheer animosity among a population towards U.S. policy. That essentially makes us all less safe. Now,
Rich, will you let me jump in? And I want to say this too about teaching kids how to read and write, because that sounds simple, and you'll often see metrics that say there are 10,000 more girls in school. That's bullshit. I'll tell you right now, that is not a real number. That is a performance of that potential capability. You have to do the affect. You have to look deeper than that. So when Rich and I are out in that valley, we ask a boy, because the girl's not going to be out, and we're like, hey, have you used this reading and learning program? And he's like, yeah, I have. Cool. Do you have your workbook? Yes. And he goes, and we trade him like a soccer ball for the workbook. He brings us a workbook, and you can see him learning to read and write in this book. This isn't something that happens because we all show up with our cameras. This is a kid so desperate to learn that he's sitting by a hand-powered dynamo radio learning how to do this, and we've got his book, and he did not want to give us his book. We had to wheel and deal with him to do it, and he did get his book back, by the way. But that's what reading and writing education looks like. It's not how many girls are in school now compared to 15 years ago, because that's never going to work. That is not how it works. Sorry to interrupt, Rich, but I had to point that clarity in there.
No, that's solid, man. And that actually leads me to my next point. In the paper, we talk about the work of an ethnographer, and she spent 12 years living among Pashtun people in Pakistan and Afghanistan, right? Now, the example Pete just gave is how this kid showed us just a few months worth of development, and we're working with this radio literacy program, sending out basically like how to read and write programs over the radio, and kids are working in workbooks and handing us in the notebooks. Well, that's just a couple of months. We've got anthropologists who've spent decades of their lives, and are we just disregarding the time that they spent learning? And in particular, the woman, Benedict Grima, that I was referencing, her book, Secrets of the Field, I mean, this was 12 years, man, 12 years. And I'd like to know, is that required reading of any FET team members right now, or going through FET training? I don't know, but I hope it is.
What do you think about the women in our military too, that they're not supporters of the FET concept, because they're out there? How many of those people did you talk to that have served in FET roles that just say, this is an absolute waste of time because of all of those pitfalls culturally, which we talked about a little bit about some of the pitfalls, like the commander's problems, up front, and those added rocks in your pack to train and priorities. And then, we talked about the male leaders in conflict zones, the second pitfall that you guys discussed in the paper. But, thirdly, the role of culture and females in our Western assumptions of empowerment. So I'm really focusing on that third ethical pitfall that you guys discussed so well. When doing this paper and doing the research, did you encounter females within our military organization that said, this is garbage, man, this is all pipe dream, because we'll never be able to get that. It will take us at least 200 more years until we even have a semblance of that in these cultures.
You got it. Okay, so our paper is actually purely our observations, right? And I didn't get a chance to interview a lot members of FET teams for this paper. That's actually, thank you, Scott. That's a good example for a follow-up paper. I can easily run that.
Yeah, I'm glad to assign the professor some homework.
well, you just did,
that's
brother.
Vindication. Yeah.
But no, this is based on our observations, and mostly the female engagement teams that I worked with, that I saw. I mean, they're on mission. They're doing what they're asked to do, But I would bring up the point, and maybe Pete can talk to this too. I'd bring up the point that, we all self-select in the service, and I'm not sure what the psychological profile is of the modern day female who decides to join the Marines or the Army, or, hey, now we're letting women go through combat arms training. Maybe it's about time, but I'm gonna go back to what we started off with, man. You can train us to do just about anything, And the other thing is, you don't just have to have a FET team full of women. You might actually need a male on that FET team who can bridge the gap between those religious elders, those old white beards, and the female engagement team that possibly has somebody who's trained in midwife, who has midwife skills. What do you call that? Midwifery? I don't know. Midwifery? I don't even know what that's called. But, a woman who has medical training, but also a woman who's got some anthropological knowledge, a woman who has, or a man who has knowledge of civil rights and human rights from a comparative perspective. Some people who know about development work and how these initiatives actually can be successful, because there is evidence of success with this stuff. Now, from the academic perspective, there is some work out there that's come across my desk where members of FET teams have been interviewed or have given their perspectives. But I mean, man, this is a chapter of our book, Pete, that I didn't even think of. So Scott's giving me homework.
Typical commander style.
I'm glad to do it. I'm glad to do it, because that means I don't have to do it. But I think all of these discussion points, whether they go into a book, and I most certainly think that that's a valid reference tool to identify a lot of these problems and break them down in a way that draws off of those ideas to, I think, help develop doctrine on how we do this. And all of the models that you were just talking about of having these robust engagement teams, and let's not even, I would submit that we don't call them FETs. We just call them ETs, engagement teams, because I do think from how our soft community operates is, again, having a combination of the right people is important. But what you're also implying is that this is going to be a massive training cost, and training costs money. So there's going to be a lot of second and third order implications on developing these concepts, developing training pipelines, writing doctrine on how to do this, writing curriculums in schoolhouses that our military members go through that maybe non-military members become a part of. Let's just say people in the development world, people in language professions, people in State Department and diplomacy issues, on how we effectively use them once the full-scale conflict and some semblance of security has been established in these zones, so they can really get out and do their job. But you've really lit the fuse on a financial and a logistic time bomb that we haven't really developed within the military structure, except at, and I don't even know where it exists within the soft community where they're willing to bring these people in, because all of our soft operators, for the most part, are male.
So let me address some of this problem-solving stuff. First, so in the Army, you can have letters behind your job code, right? So I'm a 97 Bravo hotel, which means I'm instructor certified. I've got a service modifier, so I'm able to do that. There needs to be one for interpreter operations. There's one for foreign language skill. So you need to be able to professionally be able to work an interpreter. And there's another aspect that you have to do. And these things don't cost a lot of money in terms of versus what we do now, which is piss money away and not get any results. The other thing is as you go out into that valley, and granted there has to be a certain level of military security, but as you go out in that valley to engage families, before you go there, you have to go to the governor. And here's the rule. And commanders get this. You'll get this. There's only room for one sword in the scabbard. And if it's the military commander, then don't do FET, because you have to understand how to work in that valley. And if that governor is not leading that effort, it's not time for that weapon system to be deployed. And that's the first thing, is if we just push ladies out to go do lady stuff and bring this is an actual story, bring tampons to women in a conflict zone, and they're like, yeah, we have vaginas already, and we know that we have to deal with our cycle. We have the hubris, again, to think that we're going to invent periods for ladies in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's fucking ridiculous. So you have to start allowing that governor to be the governor, and that governor needs to be able to point to, Captain Huesing and say, I need you motherfuckers to get out there and engage with women in this fashion. And you're like, yes, sir. Nam Sadie. However it's going to be, that it has to be from that point of view, and commanders have to be trained to deal with that before we can even ever dare to go talk to the women.
Here's a for you, Scott. You know what we can do with the cost of one F-35? Man, probably a lot of training, But who's not going to be happy about that? Representative Duncan Hunter out there in, Southern California, who thinks that the stuff we're talking about is a complete joke, because actually, as it turns out, they build hardware for the military in his district, and he really wants to keep that. And I understand where he's coming from, but at the same time, what could we do with the cost of one F-35?
Well, again, you're talking to the difference between policy doctrine and then programmatics. And, at the end of the day, I'm a realist that if you're going to downsize the military, or you're going to allocate and apportion money for programs and systematics, like, you're not going to cut an F-35 program. You're going to cut an infantry battalion. You're going to cut people, because, at the end of the day, and Rich and Pete, this, it's easy for the military machine to produce an infantry battalion. We can generate those things in almost, a 6-month cycle and be effective at what we do. But to cancel an entire MV-22 Osprey program or a fleet design system for a weapon system, those aren't programs we kill. And I think that, political leaders, despite on their constituency or who their backers and supporters are for fundraising for re-election, they're going to have an absolute responsibility to that, and they count on the military advisors to cut those programs. So, that's really in the ionosphere when it comes to talking about how to build these teams and make them sustainable, because there may come a point in time where we may not need these teams in the view of our military leaders. And but these programs for warplanes and warships, those things are going to be timeless. And it takes, decades to design, implement, and produce them. So that's a real challenge when you're talking about integration of military systems and political and elected officials. As I sit here in our nation's capital, man, it is you're bombarded by it. So,
Rich, I wanted to break into the episode real quick because Scott had to go, and about being in the ionosphere and weapon systems cost and the kind of problem that he was describing. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I brought up the example of the F-35, and this is something that takes, itself takes decades to produce. I mean, there's a lot of technology that has to be invented. Engineers have to do their engineering thing. Physicists have to do their thing. But, then he mentioned, we could train up an infantry battalion in 6 months. He's right. We can't build an F-35 from scratch in 6 months, right? Well, from the beginning of the development phase to the end state where this thing is in the air, flying, doing damage. But that also made me think about, we referenced Benedict Grima's work. I mean, she was on the ground for over 10 years, living in Pakistan and Afghanistan to learn what she learned. But I'm just wondering if in the course of standing up that infantry battalion in 6 months, I do think that we can help those infantrymen or women or infantry personnel understand the things that she learned. And it doesn't take 10 years to do it. Now, mind you, in training, a few weeks block of instruction, you're not going to have the level of intimacy with the material that, for example, an anthropologist does, but you can still have some understanding and appreciating for it. And we can train to that stuff. And I guess what I'm saying is, training isn't just, going out to the range and learning how to zero your weapon. There are many different components of training, but we can very easily just tweak the machine a little bit where we are helping our personnel in the Department of Defense from the bottom all the way to the top have a new appreciation for, what has become known as the human terrain,
When you're talking about dealing with female engagement in general and trying to build that capacity, I would also say that we know how to build an infantry division. We know the steps. We know the key parts, the weapons and materiel. That actually is I will say, a normal thing to be able to do, to roll out a new flag, put some numbers on it, and say this many billets exist, and then to take those people and make them, they already exist, or we already know how to make new ones in terms of training. That is not the case with this extremely complex work. I mean, you've got to have someone, I would say that to have someone do this stuff well, they need to have the commander's trust. They need to have some rank. You can't just make a new one of these. You have to have seasoned people, like you said, that self-select into this extremely challenging field. And so this is not a 6-month kind of capacity thing. And we're seeing that with the SFABs, the security, the advisory units that the military is creating now. They're struggling with what the actual task and mission will be and how to develop those skills. So when we do look at what an F-35 costs, let's understand this, that F-35 will drop fewer rounds, maybe even in training, than that FET person would throughout their career. It's just that F-35 is almost obsolete in terms of how we fight day to day. Yes, we need to have fast movers and close air support and all those things, but for a fraction of the cost, for one less airplane, which the Air Force hates, right? But you could have a lot more capacity, and that capacity is highly specialized. And it's not just something that you lay on the ground and say 2 clicks to the right, now you're shooting straight. It's constant time in the field. It's going and helping and getting partnership programs with USAID and other organizations that go to the aid world so you can understand what right looks like and then improve upon that, because let's understand, this would just create the beginnings of that kind of a program.
Yeah, and man, that's that takes a culture shift. And this is the situation where, I mean, it's their culture, the Afghans, the Iraqis, but it's our culture too. And defense culture is pretty entrenched, and this is the kind of thing on our side, you're going to have some kind of top-down initiative. We're going to have, and I believe Scott mentioned this too toward the end, you need to have a long-term perspective that we simply do not have. We got, 2-year election cycles here in this country that dictate the course of global events. And we need a culture shift here. And I think that culture shift, if it's going to happen at the top, it actually needs to, it might be started with people like us having these conversations and figuring out how to force the people at the top to recognize that, man, we're just pissing people off all over the place. And we don't have to.
So, we've been talking about a lot of great points. You guys identified 3 really salient pitfalls to your paper, which is titled, again, Recognizing the Ethical Pitfalls of Female Engagement in Conflict Zones, and published in the Journal of Military Ethics. And I think that that's really unique, is that there are a lot of ethical implications in this. And, Dr. Richard Ledet and Pete Turner and Sharon Emiegh, put together a lot of thought for this. And I just want to say that I think that this is a great paper that needs to get more traction, and I think it needs more awareness. So hopefully when we have discussions like this again on the Break It Down show, we're not just talking about this sterile paper that sits in one journal of military ethics. Is if you're a leader and if you are a lifelong learner, you really have to engage all these different aspects within the complete military spectrum to be effective. And whether you're employing those or not, I think that you guys have done a great job of identifying another area where we really need to give some critical thought to how we're fighting wars, not just now because we are still a nation at war, but how is this going to affect our 50-year plan or our 100-year plan, where so many other cultures around the world who have a deeper cultural history, but they also have a longer range plan where, again, we tend to be very short-sighted and have a Band-Aid fix to a lot of problems when we go and fight. But I think you guys have done a really good job.
Rich, if we could do one simple thing, and I do want to talk about the speed with which this needs to happen. We talk about these ethical pitfalls, and we definitely in the paper talk about, like, before you go into that valley to go engage women, you need to have done a lot of work first, pre-deployment and in the deployment. You don't just wander into a valley and say, where the bitch is at. You have got to take this at as serious and as complex as this problem is. That is how delicately you approach this. You don't not act, but you do work on the commanders first so they understand how to deploy these systems. You do deal with the elders next because they're the ones that own the ladies. They own their safety, and it's not our responsibility it's outside of our responsibility to go and engage them directly. You have to go to the elders first to allow them to establish a system that is acceptable there and will keep them alive when we leave 2 months later or 6 months later or 2 years later. And then the final thing is before you go and engage the women, like we said earlier, you need to have a command of Benedict Grima's book and all of the other books in the understanding the female aspect. But I wanted to ask you, if we could do one simple thing, like what is the easiest thing that any person who's in the military who reads this, what can they add to their toolkit? What bit of perspective, or what's a simple thing?
Oh man, that's a tough question. The simple thing to do is, it's not a simple thing, but how about having a little bit of intellectual curiosity? Because that is something that can open people's minds at the ground level. And I mean, the day-to-day operations can change if people on the ground have an open mind. And you don't just wake up one day and you're like, oh, I'm interested in the cultural aspects of gender relations in Afghanistan. You got to develop that. You got to foster that. You got to put yourself in a position where you're willing to learn, I guess. You're willing to test some of your own assumptions. And I can't get over the fact that women in Saudi Arabia can finally drive. That's bizarre. But hey, let's look at our own it's bizarre in the sense that, we don't really have a problem with women driving in this country. So we're talking about the stuff that you and I talk about all the time, which it boils down to culture, but there are nuances to this stuff. And if you don't just recognize that sometimes your assumptions might be wrong, or your policies might be grounded in the wrong or an incorrect understanding of the situation, or maybe not even incorrect, but incomplete, an incomplete understanding, right? And it's hard to fill in those gaps of understanding if you are biased by your own damn assumptions. I think if we went into, if we went into planning, at the tactical level, but also at the operational level with an open mind, I mean, we talked about it earlier. You can't tell me that somebody at the policy level wasn't anticipating these problems in 2001 when we rolled into Afghanistan. Maybe they weren't, but somebody was thinking about this, and why were those people not invited to the party?
So I want to give you the chance to ask me one more question before we wrap up here. Scott's taken off.
What did we do right in terms of FET? And not just not just female engagement teams, but the stuff that you and I were working on, or the stuff that you might have done in Iraq, or even before that. What was done right in terms of fixing it's not a gender relations problem, right? But addressing the needs or the desires of females in combat zones. What was done right, and how do we keep doing more of that?
So one of our research partners early on was a lady named Adriana Benson, and turns out she's a female. And she and I would run around Iraq, and we had full access to the unit because we'd done our job, and the commander loved us. So we were able to go out and deal with whatever elements we wanted. And Adriana always wanted to push the female narrative, and I always said that it's not time for that here. There's not enough security, and we had to have this conversation. So. And it wasn't an easy conversation. We disagreed quite a bit on it. And I don't know that either of us was right or wrong. It's one of these it's a conundrum. So I want to take a little bit of the blame off of everybody, because we are trying to solve an incredibly difficult problem in how do we help the ladies? How do we help the men and the ladies get to a spot where the ladies are contributing to the stability of their own country more reliably in a way that gets them the outside help that they truly want? And that starts like any puzzle starts, by identifying the edge pieces, by finding a corner. And finding a corner in a 5,000-piece puzzle, that's hard. And keeping track of things, and stuff gets flipped over, and mistakes are made along the way. All of that stuff has to happen to get to a point where you have a puzzle. And a lot of times in a 5,000-piece puzzle, you lose pieces, and you're like, what happened? And the picture will always be incomplete, and you always have to worry about it. And then when you go to start another 5,000-piece puzzle, you really got to want to do it. And if you don't, you're just never going to put a puzzle together like that. So this stuff is hard. It's complex, and it's delicate. And when you start something like that, it's messy. You really are flipping over pieces. You're doing a bunch of nothing that ultimately maybe helps, but you just don't have a frame of reference in how to deal with female problems in conflict zones to create a reliable and repeatable system without making a million mistakes first.
Yeah. Well, you're going to have to give yourself room for failure, it sounds like. But to learn from those failures would be a start, I guess. Takes us back to our action research model.
Yeah.
Always spend more time on the reflection phase than you think you need to spend.
Yeah, and allow if that reflection isn't full of your mistakes, then go back and reflect again, because that's really where it needs to be, because you're injecting your ego and your needs above somebody else. Still, the greatest thing I ever learned with all of this conflict zone work was there's only room for one sword in the scabbard. And if you can't handle that, then you shouldn't be on the battlefield, because that's really what this means. You cannot leave being the person who was the sword and have the person who's like, I'm supposed to be the, leaders in conflict zones die. It's politics. It's hard for them to do this. Every effort has to be made to make that person as legitimate as you can and to follow their program, because it's their program.
thank you guys for letting me ask some great questions here. It's great discussion on this episode of the Breakdown Show, and I'm looking forward for round 2 on this, grading Rich's homework assignment and coming up with some of those answers. Until the next time we get back on here and talk, guys. It's been great.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Scott.
Scott.